when you're first starting out, a pencil's pretty good for you, a ruler, straight edge, things of this nature. As you start to realize, especially when you get into the joinery aspect of it, a marking gauge does something that a pencil doesn't do. It gives you pretty much a stable mark on a wood that's consistent in thickness. As you work a pencil, because a pencil is basically sharpened on an angle, as you wear a pencil down, your line gets wider. That doesn't happen with a marking gauge. Now, they're not taught anymore in the vocational schools. If there's any left to speak of, and so you guys will see them in the secondary markets, and you just kind of wonder, do I need one? Well, eventually it makes life a lot easier. When I do a piece of furniture or something, I may have 3 or 4 marking gauges set up for a tolerance that I need, such as a dovetailing tolerance or a drawer tolerance that is going to be repetitive. I simply just set a marking gauge, mark for what it is, and set it off the side, and every time I come back, I don't have to worry about measuring anything. That gauge is set up to give me that tolerance. It's not unlike me to have 6, 7, 8, 9 marking gauges laying around and be having 2 or 3 of them in use constantly. There are different types of marking gauges. We're going to go through it, and then we're going to talk about the walkaway point. These are a tool that really can't be, to a great degree, brought back to life. They kind of got to be 3/4 there to be able to use them. But they make modern gauges and stuff, but it's just as fun to come up with an original. And the nice thing about some of the wood originals, it isn't hard for you to find an old original. And as part of your woodworking, make another one. Have some fun with it. Study what the old one was, and make another one, as well as bring one back to life. So we're going to sit down here real quick, and I'm going to bring over a board for the camera to be able to see, and I'm going to show you. This is your basic marking gauge. It has a stop on it that can be adjustable. I'm going to go ahead and take this off. Now, the stock that it's made out of, this one here is a production stock. It's done like this on purpose. It's got this radius cut into it. And if you'll notice that the stop is actually got, the fence actually is what it's called, has got a hole that corresponds with the shape of here. This particular marking gauge has scaling on the ruler scale, and that's supposed to start, I say supposed to because over a period of years of working, it doesn't always start where your point is. And you would check this by sliding this gauge down to where 0 would be and see if it stops. See this gauge here, when I lock it down, I'm every bit of a 1/16 off. So on this gauge here, I either have to make allowances within my fence for it, the stop here, or I'm going to have to just accept that this gauge, when I'm using it, is going to be off a little bit. It's going to be, short. If I set this at 1 inch and I'm expecting it to cut 1 inch, it's not going to do that. It's going to be a little bit larger than 1 inch, so I'm going to be 1 1/16. So it's just something to pay attention to. Now, when we're doing dovetailing work and we're setting a gauge to do the thickness of a board, we'll simply bring our fence up, we'll lock it against our spur here, and we don't worry about the scale on the side. We're worrying more about the thickness of our wood. So if it's 15, 16, 17, who cares? I'm working off of what stock I have on my hand right now, rather than worrying about I need to set it at 3/4 because I bought 3/4 stock. Because let me tell you, today, just because it says it's 3/4 rack doesn't mean it is. So this is what the marking gauge works. This is a more modern one. The thumb screw up here is actually plastic. It's not uncommon. The nice thing about it is it's not going to rot. It's a very broken part of most of the marking gauges, and this spur needle is also one of the few that actually has it still intact. This has the original on here. This one here is probably, I would say, from probably the 60s or 70s. So it's not uncommon to find a spur here. If it's from the 20s, especially if it's from the late 1800s, finding the original spur or the original knife on it is rare. Now, I said knife because some of our gauges, this is an older gauge here, and whoever fixed it here, I'm going to turn it around, actually used the point of a compass saw to fix his knife blade on it. And pretty ingenious. It works, good steel. I've left it intact here because I find it ingenious. You'll notice that unlike the thumb screw, this is designed, I'll tap this out here just a second. Let me grab a mallet real quick. This is designed to tap out, and it allows me to move it. It's a little tight today. It allows me to move my gauge back and forth, my fence back and forth, and then I'll tap it in. And here's where my board's going to ride down here, and my knife point here actually makes a slit into the wood. And if I have rough grain, or I have a grain that's changing or waning as it comes to my fence here, the point sometimes wants to follow that grain. And so if it's a little difficult for me to make the line, I'll flip over to a slitter like this. Now they make modern ones today. It's not hard to come up with them. This one here's got a beautiful little ebony wedge in it. This step here, obviously this gentleman, whoever was using this, was probably making drawers of some sort or working on laying up dovetails in a half blind. So it's not uncommon to find these altered in some fashion. We're not really concerned about this point here that he's cut out at one time. We're pretty much concerned with how the fence here rides up against the point. So this is just an older gauge. Now this, as it's found right now, is pretty acceptable, but it's just another type. Now the last type you're going to find is of a roller. This is an older one from the 1920s. This is and I'll explain why this is a mortising gauge here. And these rollers here, some of them are fixed, some of them turn. I prefer the ones that turn. This actually is serviceable, meaning that I can take a screwdriver, remove this, and I can get at these. Putting an edge on these is very, very tricky. So, and you're going to need real fine sandpaper or stone to do it. If they don't have an edge to them, that may be a deal breaker because of the amount of time it takes to actually get them on there. If this is rusted and locked in place, again, it may be worth just to walk away. It gets pretty involved. This one here, the beams were pretty rusted up. We cleaned it up on a wire wheel, and then we used a little bit of light sandpaper to give it so that because when it corrodes, when it rusts, it actually gets larger. So it would not move through these holes here. So we had to dress it up a little bit so it moved a little bit freer. And it's still just a little bit rough there on the end. Down here, it's not in too bad a shape. One screw locks both arms on this. And what this is for, you have two blades on here. If I were going to mark out a mortise, I would lay my blade against this knife here. I would unlock my other arm. I'd bring it over to where now it meets the other side of the chisel. I would lock it. Now when I run this gauge down the board, I have two lines or two indentations that I can have, that when I put my chisel to it, I'm guaranteed to feel this mortise the width of my chisel. That's how you set up most of your mortising gauges for your tools. If you have to set a mortising gauge up to a specific width because, say, a chair rung or a tenon meets into it, you would do the same thing with that tenon before you mark the mortise. Now, this is kind of an accurate way of getting it done. You kind of got to fumble around. The wood versions of a mortising gauge have two arms to them. And once again, it has a fence. This one has a brass thumb screw that locks it in place. This is all walnut. I have a single spur on this side that's just for doing your fielding depths of whatever, the dovetail or whatever you're doing. But it also, on the back side, I have two more spurs, and one of them is stationary. And I'm going to go ahead and remove this back as far as I can, take it off. Whoops, I dropped the plate off of that, so that I can get a better view of what I'm about to do. At the end of this is a thumb screw. There's a all-thread rod that runs all the way up to here. Instead of me trying to fumble around with two arms, I would simply take my chisel and lay it here, and I would simply open up the thread to the exact thickness that I needed, or the exact width of my chisel. All right, and then put this back together. There is a lot of them have a brass plate. Just a second here and I'll get this back together. Well, I tell you, let's just show that. This is a wear plate on the fence. Sometimes you'll hear it described as the mustache. Sometimes it's just a simple piece of brass that runs across it. I'm going to show you a more modern one here. He says looking for it. Oh, here we go. It's a little bit more modern. It's just got a bar across it, but we'll talk about this one in just a second. Today, you'll see some of them that look like this. These ridges here, this is designed to do circular work. And the wear plates are a little bit different. But you'll see these in all kind of configurations. That's designed to ride against the wood to keep from wearing into your marking gauge. This brass plate that dropped out of here, there's a small dado in there that catches that. It's designed to lock down onto the arm that just moved. All right, it's going to squish this together. It's going to squish this together, and now I can't turn this. It locks it in place. So I've actually fielded the width of my chisel or the width of my mortise, and then I'm going to set this fence to the position I want that mortise to be in the board, and then I'm going to lock it tight and it all stays together. So I can actually set a couple of things up with this gauge.